September 13th, 1946. Montelupich Prison, Kraków, Poland. A platform has been purpose-built in the prison yard for a single hanging. The man who is about to stand on it is 6 feet 4 inches tall, heavyset, a former SS captain who once commanded a concentration camp where more than 10,000 people were murdered. He is 37 years old. He has spent the past year in a Polish prison watching his world collapse around him. He attended his own trial and heard survivors describe, one after another in careful detail, what he had done to them over 19 months at Płaszów. He heard himself described as a monster. He heard himself described as a man who killed for sport. He heard his own name used as a synonym for death, the way prisoners would whisper it as a warning when he appeared in the distance. He asked the court for mercy at the end. The court declined. And now it is September 13th, 1946, and the rope is being placed around his neck. The executioner miscalculates the length of rope required. Amon Geith drops. The rope goes taut. He does not die. The executioner adjusts. Tries again. Geith drops again. Still not dead. A third attempt. This time it works. It took 3 tries to hang a man who had once shot a cook for serving soup that was too hot. This is the story of Amon Geith. Who he was. What he did. How he hid. How he was found. What the survivors said to his face in that courtroom in 1946. And why a man who showed 30 seconds of mercy to no one in his life spent his last months begging the Polish court to spare him. December 11th, 1908. Wait. Vienna, Austria. Amon Leopold Geith was born into a comfortable Catholic family. His father ran a successful publishing business. There were books in the house. There was money. There was nothing in the childhood record that suggests what was coming. He was, by all accounts available to historians, an ordinary boy from a privileged background in one of Europe's most cultured cities. Vienna, in the early 20th century, was the city of Freud, of Klimt, of Mahler. It was also the city of virulent anti-Semitism, of organized political violence, of a right-wing tradition so deep and so normalized that when a young Austrian painter named Adolf Hitler absorbed his hatreds in Vienna's streets, he was absorbing something that was already there, already structured, already waiting for someone to formalize it. Goethe found the same tradition. By his late teens, he was already affiliated with anti-Semitic paramilitary groups. In 1931, at age 22, he joined the Austrian Nazi Party. In 1932, he joined the SS. He was not pushed into these organizations. He sought them out. He rose steadily, absorbed the ideology completely, and made himself useful. When the Austrian government declared the Nazi Party illegal in 1933, Geith didn't resign. He fled to Munich, where the party operated in exile. He smuggled weapons and radios back into Austria. He was arrested by Austrian authorities in October 1933, held, released for lack of evidence. Arrested again after a failed Nazi coup attempt in 1934. Escaped custody, fled to the SS training facility at Dachau. He was 25 years old and had already built a life around sedition, weapons and party loyalty. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, Geith returned to Vienna. He married, he had children. He was a family man and a committed ideological soldier simultaneously, and he experienced no tension between those two identities. In 1940, he was conscripted into formal SS service. He progressed efficiently. By 1942, he was in the eastern occupied territories, working under SS Brigadeführer Odilo Globonik in Lublin, participating in Operation Reinhard. Operation Reinhard was the codename for the systematic murder of the Jews of occupied Poland using 3 purpose-built extermination camps, Biek, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Geith's work during this period involved rounding up Jewish populations from ghettos across the region and organizing their transport to the killing centers. The participants in Operation Reinhard were sworn to secrecy. What exactly Geith witnessed or did in those months is not fully documented. But the people loaded onto those trains went to places where almost none of them came back from. And Geith was one of the men who put them on the trains. He was good at it. His superiors praised him. On February 11, 1943, Amon Geith arrived at a newly constructed camp on the grounds of two old Jewish cemeteries on the outskirts of Kraków, in the suburb of Płaszów. The camp had been built by slave labor over the previous months. Geith had been assigned to finish its construction and then to command it. He was 34 years old and had just been given total authority over the lives of thousands of human beings. His opening address to the camp's new prisoners has been documented in multiple accounts. He told them, simply, "I am your God." He meant it literally. He had the power of life and death over everyone in the camp, and he exercised it the way other men exercised their routines, without premeditation, without ceremony, without the weight of significance that the act of killing another human being might be expected to carry for a person with a conscience. Within days of his arrival, prisoners noticed the change. Before Geith, conditions at Płaszów had been brutal but comprehensible. There were rules, punishments had causes, even if the causes were unjust. Under Geith, prisoners quickly understood that survival had nothing to do with compliance. You could follow every rule, work every hour demanded of you, keep your head down, and still be dead by nightfall because Amon Geith happened to walk past you in a particular mood. Witness Henrik Mandel later testified at Geith's trial. A rumor had spread that the new commandant was from Vienna, that conditions would improve. Within 2 days, he said, they were made aware of what conditions they could expect. The killings were daily, and they were personal. Geith did not rely primarily on the camp's formal execution mechanisms, though those operated in parallel. He killed with his own hands, with a pistol, with a rifle, regularly, and for reasons that defied categorization as punishment. He shot a Jewish cook to death because his soup was served too hot and burned Geith's tongue. He shot a woman named Batista in the back of the head because she asked him if she could stay with her fiancé during the liquidation of the Tarn ghetto, and then asked a second time after he refused the first time. He killed prisoners who walked too slowly. He killed prisoners who walked too quickly. He killed prisoners who looked at him. He killed prisoners who failed to look at him. He killed prisoners as a demonstration, selecting a random person from a group and shooting them to make a point to the others standing there. He had 2 dogs, a Great Dane named Rolf and an Alsatian mix named Ralph. They were not pets in any recognizable sense of the word. They were weapons. Geith had them trained to attack prisoners on command. Survivor Arthur Kuhnreich testified to what he personally witnessed. Geith set his dog on a Jewish prisoner. The dog tore the victim apart. When the prisoner stopped moving, Geith shot him. The shooting, in this account, was almost incidental, almost a courtesy, performed after the meaningful damage had already been done. Survivor Joseph Bau, prisoner number 69084, later described Geith in the following terms: a hideous and terrible monster who reached the height of more than 2 meters. He set the fear of death in people, terrified masses, and accounted for much chattering of teeth. He ran the camp through extremes of cruelty that are beyond the comprehension of a compassionate mind, employing tortures which dispatched his victims to hell. Bau was a trained artist. He chose these words precisely. The villa Geith occupied at the edge of the camp compound, overlooking the grounds, became synonymous with the arbitrary terror of his rule. From elevated positions near the villa, or from within the camp itself, he used a rifle to shoot prisoners as they moved through the yard, not during escape attempts, not in response to any violation of camp rules. He would raise a rifle, select a target from among the thousands of people going about the coerced routines of their survival, and fire. Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, one of 2 Jewish women Geith kept as domestic servants in the villa, later described what it was like to exist within that house. When we saw him from a distance, everybody was hiding, in latrines, wherever they could hide. Never would I, never, believe that any human being would be capable of such horror, of such atrocities. She and the other maid, Helen Hirsch, were beaten by Geith repeatedly, beaten in the cellar of the villa that they cleaned and cooked in, trapped in a house attached to a camp where they watched thousands die. Both survived. Both testified. During the liquidation of the Kraków ghetto on March 13, 1943, 1 month after Geith assumed command of Płaszów, he personally participated in the killing. Witnesses recorded that he shot approximately 50 children during the clearing operation. The number varies across testimonies. Some accounts put it higher. What does not vary across accounts is the fact that he was present, armed and firing. The ghetto was emptied. Those deemed fit for labor were marched to Płaszów. Several thousand deemed unfit were sent to extermination camps. Hundreds were killed in the streets during the clearing. Geith was in the streets with them. The liquidation of the Tarnow ghetto followed in September 1943. 25,000 Jews had lived in Tarn at the start of the war. By the time Geith arrived to close it, 8,000 remained. They were assembled in Magdeburg Square, surrounded by armed guards. The trains were loaded and departed the following day. Most were sent to Auschwitz. Fewer than half survived the journey. Most of those who arrived were deemed unsuitable for labor and were murdered immediately on arrival. Geith, according to trial testimony, personally shot between 30 and 90 women and children during this operation. The range reflects the difficulty of precise accounting in the chaos of a forced evacuation conducted through violence. The Sebny camp liquidation added another chapter. Sebny held 4,000 Jewish prisoners and 1,500 Polish slave laborers when Geith was given authority over its closure. He dispatched subordinates to manage the actual killing. 700 Jews were driven in lorries to a forest in Tarnwick, 3 kilometers from the camp, and shot. The remainder were sent to Auschwitz. Geith then had all of Sebny's supplies sorted and transported to Płaszów for his own use. Efficiency mattered to him. The logistics of murder and the logistics of personal enrichment occupied the same untroubled mental space. Because alongside the killing, Geith was stealing. Systematically, boldly, and in quantities that eventually became a problem, even by the standards of an organization that had made theft of Jewish property official policy. He misappropriated furniture, furs, clothing, jewelry, tobacco, and alcohol during the Tarnow ghetto liquidation. When German investigators later searched his stores, they found 80,000 Reichsmarks that he could not account for. He sold rations intended for camp prisoners on the black market. He killed his own Jewish assistant, who had been helping him fence stolen goods, when the arrangement became a liability. He then killed the assistant's family. He treated the camp as a personal enterprise, extracting value from it in every direction simultaneously: labor, goods, cash, and the psychological satisfaction of absolute power. At its peak, Płaszów held 25,000 permanent inmates. A staff of 636 guards oversaw a camp that also processed 150,000 people in transit over the course of its operation. The smell of the crematorium was part of the air. Summary executions on the hill behind the camp were routine. The roll calls were mechanisms of terror. Every morning, prisoners assembled knowing that Geith might walk among them with a pistol in his hand. Every evening, prisoners returned to barracks, counting themselves lucky to have lasted another day. Some of them were lucky a remarkable number of days. Many were not lucky at all. One documented incident from the trial proceedings captures the texture of daily life under Geith's command with particular clarity. During a public hanging of 2 prisoners named Haubenstock and Krautworth, the rope used on Haubenstock snapped. Someone in the crowd whispered to Haubenstock that he should beg Geith for mercy. Geith ignored the appeal and ordered the hanging repeated. While preparations were made for the second attempt, Krautworth, still alive, managed to cut his own wrists with a razor blade he had concealed. He was already unconscious from blood loss when he was taken to the gallows and hanged anyway. Geith then walked to the 2 hanging bodies and fired his pistol into their heads to confirm they were dead. This was routine administration for Amon Geith. It was a workday. Among the people who observed Geith's operation at Płaszów was a German industrialist named Oskar Schindler, who had established a factory adjacent to the camp and employed Jewish slave laborers supplied by Geith. Schindler was not a good man in any simple sense. He was an opportunist, a member of the Nazi Party, a man who had profited substantially from the slave labor system. But he also watched what Geith did, and something in him recoiled from it. He bribed Geith. He bribed him regularly and expensively, with alcohol, with luxury goods, with the things that Geith loved to accumulate. And in doing so, he moved his workers out of Geith's direct reach, established his factory as a place slightly apart from the worst of what was happening at Pastwu, and eventually saved over 1,200 lives by having his workers transferred to a factory he established in Czechoslovakia. Schindler's actions, and the list his secretary Mietek Pemper compiled of the workers to be transferred, became the subject of a novel and then a film seen by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Pemper, who had worked as Geith's forced stenographer, had used his privileged access to information to help Schindler understand which prisoners were most at risk. He was the man who helped build the list. He was also one of the witnesses who stood in that courtroom in 1946 and told the judges exactly what Geith had dictated to him. Exactly what he had seen. In September 1944, Geith was arrested, not by enemies, by his own organization. The SS internal security apparatus charged him with theft of Reich property, corruption, violation of regulations, and mistreating prisoners through violence and starvation. That last charge is remarkable. The SS, an organization that had established and operated a continent-wide system of mass murder, found Amon Geith's personal conduct sufficiently extreme to warrant internal disciplinary action. The charges were processed. He was held in a Breslau prison. He was subsequently diagnosed with diabetes. In January 1945, with Germany disintegrating and the record system collapsing, the charges were dropped. He was transferred to an SS sanatorium in Bad Thiels, Bavaria. He was a patient in a rest facility while the war ended around him. American forces arrested him there in May 1945. He was wearing a Wehrmacht uniform, not an SS uniform. He told them he was a regular army officer. He gave a false rank. He did not admit to being Amon Geith, commandant of Pastwu. Researchers working decades later in the 2020s found documentation confirming what survivor Josef Lokovich had long claimed, that the Americans initially lost Geith in their prisoner population, that he was swallowed by the chaotic processing of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war, that he might never have been identified at all. Lukovich, who had been a prisoner at Pastwu, spent months tracking him down. He gathered former prisoners, identified Geith, and made sure the Polish authorities had what they needed to request extradition. The request was honored. Geith was transferred to Poland. He was tried before the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland in Kraków between August 27 and September 5, 1946, 19 months at Pastwu. 1 year of sporadic operation before that, under Geith's supervision across multiple ghetto liquidations. The total accounting of deaths for which he bore direct or commanding responsibility ran to more than 10,000 confirmed. The actual number was almost certainly higher. The trial lasted 10 days. The witnesses were the people who had survived him. Mietek Pemper, who had been forced to take Geith's dictation. Rosa Grunberg, 19 years old. An office clerk who had been in Pastwu from its first day. Henrik Mandel. Arthur Kuhnreich, Helen Hirsch. One after another, they stood in the same room as Amon Geith and told the court what he had done. They pointed at him. They described individual killings they had personally witnessed. They described his dogs. They described the sounds from the hill where the executions happened. They described what it had been like to see him walking toward them from a distance and to understand, with absolute certainty, that the next few seconds might end their lives for reasons having nothing to do with anything they had done. Survivor Mila Pfefferberg, who later visited the set of the film made about this period, suffered a panic attack when she saw the actor playing Geith in SS uniform. The physical resemblance to the real man, in the real clothes, was enough to trigger something she could not control. That is what he had done to people. He had inhabited their nervous systems so completely that 40 years later, in a film studio in Poland, the sight of an approximation of him produced involuntary terror. Gith's defense was the same defense that had been raised at Nuremberg and rejected there. I was following orders. Any deaths that occurred were authorized by my superiors. I was acting within my disciplinary jurisdiction as commandant. The tribunal was not persuaded. The evidence was not of a man reluctantly executing orders he had been given. It was of a man who had killed personally, daily, for reasons that had nothing to do with any order he had received. A man who had beaten women in his own cellar, set trained dogs on prisoners for sport, shot a cook for burning his tongue, fired a rifle at moving figures in the yard below from a position of elevated comfort. Whatever orders he had been given, the orders had not told him to do those things. He had done them because he wanted to. During the proceedings, something shifted in Gith. The man who had told his prisoners that he was their god, who had shot a woman in the head for asking a question twice, who had watched hangings go wrong and ordered them repeated without visible emotion, asked the Polish court for mercy. He asked the chairman of the tribunal to spare his life. He described himself as having acted under the authority of his superiors. He raised his personal circumstances, his mental health history, the diagnosis of psychological disturbance that the SS's own doctors had made in 1944. The court heard this. The court voted. The verdict came on September 5, 1946. Guilty on all counts. Death by hanging. 8 days later, September 13, 1946, the Montelupich Prison, which had itself been a Gestapo detention and execution center during the occupation, the place where Poles had been tortured and killed during the very years Gith was operating past W. The platform had been built specially. Gith was brought out. He was 6 feet 4 inches, heavier than he had been when he ran the camp. The war had not diminished him physically in the way it had diminished everyone at Pass W. The executioner miscalculated the rope length. Gith dropped. The rope snapped taut. He did not die. His weight, his height, the physics of the drop, the arithmetic of hanging that the executioner had gotten wrong. The drop was too short. He was still alive. The executioner adjusted the rope. A second attempt. Gith dropped again. Still not dead. A third preparation. A third drop. This time, finally, the calculation was right. His last words, according to the historical record, were Heil Hitler. The man who had asked the court for mercy, who had described his circumstances, who had invoked his superiors and his mental state and his compliance with a system, raised the Nazi salute with his final breath. The mercy he had begged for, the system he pointed to in his defense, and the ideology he saluted at the end. All three in the same man. His remains were cremated. The ashes were thrown into the Vistula River. There is no grave, there is no marker, there is nowhere to go. But there is another story that comes after his death, and it is, in its own way, as disturbing as what preceded it. Ruth Irene Calder had been Gith's mistress at Paspa. She had moved in with him, lived in the villa, eaten the meals prepared by the 2 women named Helen who feared him every minute of every day. She had described Gith, when she first saw him, as love at first sight. She had a daughter by him, born in November 1945, after his arrest, after the war. She named the daughter Monica. She told Monica as she grew up that her father had been a good man, a war hero, a man worth loving and honoring. In 1983, after the publication of Thomas Keneally's novel about Schindler and Gith, Ruth Irene Calder was interviewed by the BC. She saw, for the first time, a transcript of Gith's war crimes trial. The interviewer showed her the testimony. She read what the survivors had said about the man she had loved. She defended him. She called him charming. The following evening, she took an overdose of sleeping pills. She died. Monica Hertwig, Gith's daughter, grew up not knowing who her father was. When she discovered the truth as a young adult, it produced a breakdown she described as the destruction of everything she thought she knew about herself and where she came from. She watched Spielberg's film when it was released in 1993. It destroyed her again. She spent years trying to understand how to hold what she carried. She eventually participated in a documentary called Inheritance, in which she traveled to Poland and met Helen Sternlicht Jonas Rosenzweig, one of the two maids who had lived in the villa's basement. In the house itself, the house where her father had beaten Helen Sternlicht in the cellar, the two women sat together in that house. One of them had lived there in terror. The other had been conceived there. The film records what that meeting was like. It is not easy to watch. The camp at Płaszów no longer physically exists in the way that Auschwitz, now a museum and memorial, physically exists. The barracks were demolished. The grounds became open land on the edges of a growing city. 4 monuments stand there now. The hill where the executions were conducted, where Geith walked with a rifle, is just a hill. People walk their dogs on it. Children play near it. The city has grown around it and through it, and the weight of what happened there is carried not in the landscape, which has been reclaimed, but in the testimony. In the recorded voices of Pemper and Grunberg, and Mandel and Kuhnreich, and both of the Helens. In the court documents. In the photographs, including the photographs of Geith himself, standing on a balcony with a rifle, photographed by someone who found the scene worth documenting, a man taking aim at other human beings for the private pleasure of it. What Amon Geith represents in the historical record is not a mystery. He was not a cog in a machine that would have operated identically without him. He was not a reluctant participant carrying out reluctant orders. He was a man who had wanted this, who had sought out the ideology and the organization and the position that gave him the power to do what he did, and who had then done it with enthusiasm that even the SS found excessive. He killed with his hands because he wanted to feel the killing. He used dogs because he enjoyed watching. He shot a rifle into the camp yard from a position of comfort because the randomness was itself the pleasure. The uncertainty he created in every prisoner, the impossibility of safety, the knowledge that compliance meant nothing, that following every rule left you just as exposed as breaking them, this was not an accidental byproduct of his management. It was the point. He stood in a courtroom in 1946 and heard 11 days of testimony about what he had done, and when it was his turn to speak in his own defense, he said he was following orders. He had not, in those months of imprisonment and trial, produced anything that resembled acknowledgement of what his victims had experienced. He had produced a legal strategy. When the verdict came and it was death, he asked for mercy. When the rope was around his neck, he said, "Heil Hitler." The word that refuses to leave this story, the word that sits at the center of it and cannot be moved, is ordinary. Not in what he did. What he did was the furthest thing from ordinary, but in what he was before he did it. A boy from Vienna, a publisher's son, a Catholic family, books in the house, money in the bank. He chose the Nazi Party when he was 22 years old. He chose the SS when he was 23. He chose every step of the path that led him to that villa in Płaszów, to those 2 dogs, to that rifle, to the hill where the dead were buried in layers. And then, at the end, when the path had brought him to a rope that took 3 attempts to kill him, he chose Heil Hitler. The people who survived him are the measure of what he did. Not the historical footnotes, not the war crime statutes, not even the film that made his name known worldwide. The people who survived him are the measure. Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, Helen Hirsch, Mietek Pemper, Josef Lukowitz, who spent months hunting him through a prisoner population to make sure he faced a court. All of them carried what happened at Płaszów for the rest of their lives, in their bodies, and in their sleep, and in the involuntary panic that came from seeing a man in an SS uniform in a film studio 40 years later. Amon Geith was hanged on September 13, 1946. It took 3 tries. His ashes are in the Vistula River. That is the end of his story. The story of the people he left behind does not end there, because that kind of story never ends where the perpetrator ends. It goes on as long as the survivors are alive, and then it goes on in their children, and in their testimony, and in the record. The record is this: he was their God. He told them so himself. And for 19 months at Płaszów, it was true.